Hi everybody, in this video we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So in another video we learned how to solve the quadratic by the quadratic formula. And previously we learned how to solve the quadratic using a graph. So now you have three different ways to solve a quadratic. You actually have four, because back in the day, you learn how to solve a quadratic by factoring, okay? So now you have four different methods for solving a quadratic: by factoring, completing the square, quadratic formula, and graphing. All right, so let's go ahead and get at it. We want to do this one by completing the square. If you recall, the first step to completing the square is, and it doesn't change, right, is identify b, and we're going to do b over 2 squared. All right. So first of all, we got to identify our b. Our b here is always with our linear term. So in this case, it's going to be 10. So we're going to take 10. We're going to divide it by 2. And we're going to square it. So 10 over 2 is 5. And 5 squared is 25. So remember, to complete the square, we are creating perfect square trinomials, right? So whatever you add on one side of the equation, we want to keep it balanced. You got to add on the other side of the equation. This is different from before, because before we wanted to keep it balanced, but because it was on the same side that we were adding, right? So we adding a number on the same side, we want to subtract it from the same side. Now we're on opposite sides of the equal sign. So if I add it over here, I want to add it over here to keep the equation balanced. Now, voila, we have created a perfect square trinomial. We learned before that completing the square creates perfect square trinomials, all right? Perfect square trinomials, that's what it creates. And a perfect square trinomial can be factored like this. Well, first of all, it looks like this, right? A squared plus or minus 2ab plus b squared, and can be factored into a plus or minus b squared. Remember, that just means that it could be a plus b times a plus b, which is the same thing as saying a plus b squared. Or it could be a minus b times a minus b, which is the same thing as saying a minus b squared. So if the question only asks you what do you need to add to both sides, we've done our job. We took half of b, squared it, and we added it to both sides. So we're finished with that one. That's the first step. Now, if I were to go take this a step further, remember this right here is a perfect square trinomial, so I can write it in its factored form. I can write this in its factored form of, remember, what goes in the parentheses is what you simplified here. So z, make sure we use the correct variable, z plus 5, all right, squared is equal to, and then over here, remember we talked about simplifying it. So 2 plus 25 is going to be 27. And that's how we would do it when it's an equation, okay? Not a function. So let's use those same ideas and go on to the next one. Here we have x squared plus 3x equals 40. Notice that the 40 is already over there, so there's no need for me to make space like I normally do. All right, so let's go ahead and start this problem. And let's make space. So x squared plus 3x plus blank. 40 is already over there, so I'm going to leave 40 over there. And whatever I add to one side, we just talked about it, we got to add to the other side. Okay, so in order to figure out what to add to both sides, we have to take half of b and square it. So my b is that 3 right there. So we're going to say 3 over 2 squared. Remember, 3 over 2 times 3 over 2 is the same thing as saying 3 over 2 squared. You multiply straight across. 3 times 3 is 9, and 2 times 2 is 4. So the number that's actually added to both sides is going to be 9 over 4. All right. And so our problem, let's go ahead and read it. It says, first use the completing the square process to write this equation in the form D and E. Now, look, let's talk about this D and E because I don't want you to get confused. Sometimes it's written like this. Sometimes it's written as x plus h squared is equal to k, right? So don't get confused about the D and the E. All right, those are the same. Those are the same. Okay? All right, doesn't matter what letter we're using there, they're in the same location. All right, so let's continue solving this problem. First things first, I got to write this as a factored form because they said to write it like so on this side, right? On this side, it's got to be written as x plus d squared. So let's go ahead and rewrite this expression. So I'm going to rewrite it factor. And remember, what goes inside is what would have been simplified had it simplified. So that's going to be x. I'm going to follow the sign up here. So that's going to be plus 3 over 2. And then we're going to square it. Okay? So that's what comes in on this side. X plus 3 over 2 and squared. On the other side, we got to combine like terms. So 40 plus 9 over 4. We got to go ahead and combine those terms so that we can work out the problem. Okay, so I'm going to actually work this out over here. And I'm not going to use decimals because we want to get the fraction. And I know decimals is going to give me a decimal. So 40, all right, I want to have the same decimal, the same denominator as 4. So I can add, I need to make these like terms so I can actually add them. So 160 over 4 gives me 40, right? Plus 9 over 4. All right, so 160 plus 9 is 169. And then when you add, you keep the denominator, so 169 over 4. So this equation is going to be equal to 169 over 4. And that's the part that comes right here. Okay, so now we're ready to solve this problem. Let's go ahead and finish it off and solve it. Now, in order to solve this, we actually have to do the opposite of the square. The opposite of square is square root. The opposite of square is square root. And so whatever you do on one side of the equation, you have to do on the other side of the equation. So square and square roots are inverses of each other. Therefore, they are going to cancel each other out. So this squared, like the square root symbol and the square, actually cancels each other out. And we're left with x plus 3, just x plus 3 from under the radical. So the radical is actually removed. Okay. Now we're going to take the square root of 169 over 4. Now, we got to be careful about this because here's what you need to know. All right. Side note. Square root of 4 is plus or minus 2. And the reason why is because 2 times 2 is 4, right? And negative 2 times negative 2 is also a positive 4. That means there's two answers. Do not forget the plus or minus. You must always include that plus or minus. You remember when we was learning the quadratic formula? That's why we were doing the plus or minus. Because when you take the square root of a number, you have to have the positive and the negative root. So the square root of 169, all right, so it's going to be plus or minus the square root of 169 over 4. All right, so let's take the square root of 169 over 4, actually. So the square root of 169, you can actually separate it, right? So you can say square root of 169, you can say square root of 4. All right, so the square root of 169 is actually 13. The square root of 4 is actually 2. So that's 13 over 2. So we have x plus 3 halves is equal to plus or minus 13 over 2. Got to be careful. Got to include that plus or minus. That plus or minus is so important. If you don't include it, you're going to get the answer wrong simply because you forgot to include the plus or minus. Now we're going to get x by itself. So subtract 3 halves from both sides, which means we got two problems over here, y'all. Okay? So we have x is equal to negative 3 halves plus 13 over 2. And we have x is equal to negative 3 halves minus 13 over 2. All right. So we're ready to go ahead and ready to simplify and solve this. So here we go. Negative 13. Remember, we keep the denominator, right? So negative 13 plus 13 is a positive 10 over 2. 10 over 2 is 5. Okay? Now, negative 3 minus 13 is actually negative 16. Negative 16 divided by 2 is actually negative 8. So our answers are, we are separated by a comma, are 5 and negative 8. And that's it. That's how you solve by completing the square. All right, hold on tight. We got two more examples for you. All right, so in this problem, it's a little different in that we have r squared plus 14r plus 46 is equal to 9. So we're going to have to move that 46 over to the other side. So let's go ahead and start by writing it down so that we can move what we need to move. So r squared plus 14r plus 46 equals 9. We're going to subtract 46 from both sides. All right, because we want that first two terms to stay over there so that we can go ahead and complete the square with it. So r squared plus 14r is equal to 9 minus 46. 9 minus 46 is, I want to say 37, negative 37. Let's use decimals to check our answer. I was right, it's negative 37. So let's go ahead and go back to our problem to finish it up. All right, so here we are. And we're going to make some space, right? So let's go ahead and actually write this again. And where we're actually creating the space, right? So it's not a part of anything. So we're adding something here we don't know yet is equal to negative 37. And remember, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. All right? Because remember, we're trying to keep the equation balanced. We got to always think about that, right? We got to keep the equation balanced. So if you're on the same side of the equation, you add and subtract. But when you're on different sides of the equation, you add and you add to keep it balanced. All right, so we're going to do half a b and square it. So our b is 14. All right, so we're going to say b over 2 squared, which is 14 over 2, all right, squared, which is 7, right, squared, which is 49. So we're going to actually add 49 to both sides. That's what we're adding to both sides. All right, and this is actually asking us to write it in the form of r minus a squared. Remember I told you don't get bogged down about those letters? I meant that. Don't get bogged down by letters. This is the same thing as saying x minus h squared plus k, which was the same thing as saying x minus d squared plus e. Like, it just doesn't matter. So this time they're saying r minus a squared equals b. It don't matter, right? So I'm sorry, this is supposed to be equal to k, that's supposed to be equal to e. So let me go ahead and change those. Doesn't matter what letter they use, they're asking you the same question. All right, so let's rewrite this because we said this is going to be your perfect square trinomial. One number goes inside the parentheses, that number right there, because it was simplified from 14 over 2. So we get r plus, because I got to follow the sign here, 7 squared is equal to negative 37 plus 49. Negative 37 plus 49 is actually equal to 8. Equal to 8. No, it's not equal to 8. It is equal to 12. That's 12. All right, check the math. Go to Desmos, check the math. Make sure we get 12. All right, so now we can go further. Remember, we got to get rid of this square. The way we get rid of the square is by taking the square root of both sides. So the square root of r plus 7 squared is equal to the square root of 12. And remember, we talked about earlier that when you take the square root, you got to do plus or minus, right? And that we also talked about how the radicals actually cancel each other out. The radical and the square cancel each other out because they're inverses. So that just leaves us with r plus 7 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 12. Now we got to check to see if 12 can be simplified. So 12 can be simplified. It has a 4, okay? And actually, I'm going to simplify 12 over here. So square root of 12 can be simplified into the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 3, we cannot simplify, so we leave it as is. So r plus 7 is equal to plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Now we got to get r by itself. So subtract 7 from both sides. And our final solution is r equals, because the 7's cancel out, negative 7 plus or minus 2 root 3. Now remember, this is two different solutions, so we can actually write them separately. Okay? We can write them separately. So r is negative 7 plus 2 square root of 3. R is also negative 7 minus 2 square root of 3. Okay? Now, what do we plug into our equation up here so that we can write our answer? So this here is what we plug into our equation during the halfway mark, right? R plus 7 goes here. R plus 7 squared equals 12. That's what goes there. In the next blank, it asks us for the solution. So what goes there are our solutions, which are these two numbers here. So we write negative, and actually I'm going to write it underneath here so that I can write it the way they want us to write it. So negative 7, all right, plus SQRT. Hold on, we've got to clean that up. Negative 7 plus 2 times SQRT3, and negative 7 plus 2 times is actually going to be minus, right? Because 1 is plus, 1 is minus. So negative 7 minus 2 times SQRT times 3. Of 3. There you go. That's how you type that answer in. All right, let's go on to the last example. Now this one is a little bit longer just because I wanted to give you video. It's a little bit longer because I want to give you an example of each type of problem. So you probably want to break this up into two different viewings so that you don't get overwhelmed, okay? There's 4 examples, so you can watch the first 2 and then watch the other 2 later. All right, so let's go ahead and finish this example. This one has a leading coefficient, right? That leading coefficient is 3. And just like we did in the previous problems, we want to do something about that. We need to do something about that in order to solve it. So 3x squared plus 5x plus 2 is equal to 0. Okay? I'm going to start by making my leading coefficient a 1. All right? Factor out the leading coefficient. Now, factoring is the same thing as dividing. So we're going to divide everything by 3. 3, 3, and 3. That makes this a little messy, but we don't want the 3. So that leaves us with x squared because the 3's cancel out, right? Plus 5 over 3x plus 2 over 3 equals, what's 0 divided by 3? 0. Now we're going to make space, all right, for our to complete the square. So that means we got to take this 2/3 to the other side of the equation. The other side of the equation meaning the equal sign. So that gives us x squared plus 5/3x is equal to 0 minus 2/3 is negative 2/3. Okay, so now let's rewrite this so that we can go ahead and do what we do, which is half of b and square it. So I'm going to make space because I'm going to make a perfect square trinomial. Remember, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So if I add something on one side, I got to add it to the other side. So here we go. To add to the other side, we're going to do b over 2. So what's our b? 5/3. So b over 2 square it is going to be 5/3 over 2 and squared. Remember last time we had a fraction and it didn't, we had it turned out to be a decimal, right? We didn't want that to happen. So we had to work it out by hand to get the fraction. So that's what we're going to have to do here, okay? So let's do 5/3 divided by 2 first. So 5/3 divided by 2 is really the same thing as saying 5/3 times 2, right? Times 1/2, I should say, the reciprocal. So remember to multiply straight across, and that gives me 5/6. Okay? Now I'm going to take that number and I'm going to square it. So 5/6 squared is 25/36. So the number that's being added here is 25/36. So voila, we've created a perfect square trinomial. Let's go ahead and write the expression on the left-hand side that it factors into. So we have x, and remember, this simplified to 5/6, that b over 2 simplified to 5/6. So 5/6 is actually what goes inside the parentheses because this is positive, this is also going to be positive. So plus 5/6 squared is equal to negative 2/3 plus 25/36, which we need to combine those like terms to find that answer. As I mentioned before, we want to keep fractions, right? So we're going to have to make this an equivalent fraction. So times 12 is negative 24 times 12 is over 36 plus 25/36. All right, that means that this is equal to 1/36. So x plus 5/6 squared is equal to 1/36. We're going to take the square root of both sides to get rid of the square. So that leaves us with x plus 5/6. Remember, because those two things cancel each other out, right? The radical and the square cancel each other out because they're inverses. So that leaves us with x plus 5/6 with no parentheses is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1/36. So the square root of 1/36, remember that's the square root of 1 over square root of 36. Square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 36 is 6. So that's over 1/6. We're almost finished. So we got to subtract 5/6 from both sides to get x by itself. And x is equal to negative 5/6. Remember I said that plus or minus 1/6? That gives us two problems, y'all. The first problem is x is equal to negative 5/6 plus 1/6. The second one is negative 5/6 minus 1 over 6. So let's go ahead and simplify those. Negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4 over 6, which is negative 2 over 3. Negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6 over 6, which is equal to negative 1. So our solutions are negative 2/3 and negative 1. Negative 2/3 and negative 1. All right, but we're not finished with this problem because remember it said to write down the equivalent equation. And so our equivalent equation was this right here. X plus 5 over 6 squared equals 1 over 36. So let's go ahead and write that in there. X plus 5 over 6 squared is equal to 1 over 36. And voila, we're finally finished.